Welcome to Testing in the Pub.
Today we're going to be talking particularly around thinking skills. So those skills that are absolutely critical to software testing, and looking into a number of areas around knowledge, around influence, and around asking questions, and basically about how we should think.
Cool. So I think we should start with lateral thinking versus critical thinking, because this is key for testers. It's a key skill. I would say it's one of the most important skills for a tester. It's lateral thinking skills. So what is lateral thinking? Steve, what do you think lateral thinking is?
Well, it's essentially the ability to think more broadly, not just get focused on a single line of questioning, for want of a better way of putting it, a single line of thought, and be able to. Thinking outside the box is a really kind of cheesy phrase.
Everybody says that.
But it's that ability to think of options which do not, at first instance, appear maybe particularly logical to somebody who's thinking critically, to somebody who's just almost pursuing a single path.
Yeah, I would agree. With critical thinking, my interpretation of critical thinking is that if you're looking for the answer for something, it's the direct path to that answer.
Yeah.
But whereas lateral thinking, there's all the scenarios around about getting that answer, and also, what if you don't do that direct path? What if you go 10 steps backwards first, and go to the shop, and then come back and then do this, or do something else?
Maybe you need some blue sky thinking to go with that, thinking outside the box.
Blue sky thinking.
Blue sky thinking.
Like it.
Nice.
Okay. So why is lateral thinking important? Because it offers us the chance to generate more questions that we can ask.
It does. It offers us the ability, I think, to also think in a way that the developer probably has. Developers think logically. That's how software is built. They have logic. They have logical, scientific brains most usually, and they pursue single paths more than I think testers should.
I think that's changing though. A lot of developers, well, not all developers, but certainly a lot of developers are getting the importance of testing, and they are starting to understand that they need to think about the variables about what they're developing as well. I mean, you'll still get, say, the odd developer, if you ask them how they tested their feature before releasing it, they'll probably say the happy path. But I think a lot more, well, certainly from the developers that I've paired with, while they've been developing, they've started getting the idea that they need to think about other things. But there's still a lot to be done there around about that.
Yes, maybe slightly unfair to stereotype massively, but
definitely.
I think if we are going to generalise, I think it's probably fair to say that a structured mind in that sense does tend to produce or take that single path through something, whether you call it the happy path or whether you call it something else.
Do you know what I think it might be? I think it's because they're thinking constructively. Because they're building a product, they have to have that mindset where they're being very constructive with the product. So they're building it piece by piece. Whereas testers, on the other hand, think destructively.
Do they
think about how the system might break and how we can pull the system apart. We're not necessarily negative.
No.
Because I'd like to think that when you're communicating, you should be very positive about your discoveries that you make while you're investigating the software. And you need to be very positive in bug reports, or some certain tests that you're running might be to determine how good the product is, not to find as many bugs as you can. You know? So,
and also that communication back to the developers, it's always that classic case of, if you only come to me and tell me that my code that I've spent weeks writing is crap, then you're probably not going. I'm not going to be your friend, and I'm probably not going to. You're not going to be able to influence me as effectively as if you presented that in a much more positive way.
Yeah, like in my first job, I can totally relate to that, because the way that the company was set up is we had the test department, and then across the other side of the room we had the development department, and it was very much waterfall, and it was them versus
big wall
us.
in between.
But the
metaphorically.
entire company, whenever we had a company outing, whether it was like go-karting or something that we'd do as a company, it was always developers versus testers. We had football tournaments set up internally in the organisation for 5-a-side, and it was testers versus developers constantly. So it was I've sort of caught you out because your code's got a bug in it sort of attitude.
Yeah. It's not healthy.
It wasn't. It really wasn't. There was a lot of times where developers would get really agitated and angry and say that they weren't working with certain testers, or vice versa. Testers would get upset when developers would tell them where to go or whatnot.
Absolutely.
And, so, but now I think majority of companies now are agile, right? So even government projects are now running agile.
Yeah, things are changing.
So I think because there's a much closer working relationship between everyone in the team, not just testers and developers, I think there's a bigger understanding of what people, or at least there should be a bigger understanding of what people's roles are within the teams.
Yeah. So that ability to think laterally in that context becomes even more important, I would say.
Yeah. For a tester as well, because testers
absolutely.
have to, in a sense, teach developers this as well.
Yeah.
You know, through pairing or through highlighting their test coverage to the team. You know?
Yeah. Or even just something as simple as that. What if?
Yeah.
What about this?
Sizing meetings are great for that, because you'll always get a developer that'll put their planning poker card up, and it'll be 3, and then the tester will put it up and it'll be 21. And then you get a discussion going, and then because of that discussion, developers will learn from that. You know.
Yeah.
Or a tester might learn to rein it in a bit if it's out of scope. You know? So
Absolutely. I think it goes both ways. I think you can, there's an element of how both disciplines understand risk, but I think there's a happy medium somewhere there in the middle.
Definitely. So, what do you think of Michael Bolton's terminology when he uses sapient testing?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think, to me, it's very important that we make the differentiation between testing and checking. I think that's something which I'm at pains to stress to people as often as possible. Particularly when it comes around automation, it helps get rid of those myths of automation will replace manual testing, and we just need automation.
The magic wand.
Absolutely, yes, the unicorn of automation. But the idea of sapient. I mean, sapient essentially meaning done by or conducted a human activity. Essentially, I think it does kind of make sense, but I do wonder that it could potentially be kind of a bit of terminology too far.
Well, no, I think it's a good thing, and I'll try and use it whenever it's appropriate. But what I'm finding right now is that no one else outside of testing knows this term.
Particularly outside of context-driven testing.
Yeah, exactly. So if I'm speaking with my team and I'm chatting with developers and trying to explain the difference between sapient testing and automation, and they're confused straight away. What is sapient testing? And then you say, okay, well, sapient testing is what you know as manual testing, and then straight away they're like, oh, right, so you're talking about manual testing versus automation. And then you're kind of like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. But then they just keep referring to it as manual testing. So it's not working at the moment. I think we need more widespread terminology. And I don't know how we're going to get there.
No,
really.
I think that's why I like it, keeping it as simple as the difference between testing and checking, and then building on the fact that checking is something that can be automated, testing is something that requires a human brain. It is therefore inherently sapient, but it uses terminology that are more widely understood.
Yeah, but the same problem applies with automation, because a lot of people know automation is automated testing, right?
Yeah, I
When
think
it's
it's
not
I think
really
it's
testing,
I
it's
think it's
checking.
easy.
So,
I think it's easier to change that understanding though, because the idea that a machine checks is something that people kind of get a little bit more. I think.
yeah. Tell me about tacit and explicit knowledge.
Yeah, tacit and explicit knowledge. So tacit knowledge is essentially something which it's knowledge which you couldn't teach somebody else implicitly. So if you, I don't know, consider riding a bike, for example. You can teach somebody how to get on a bike, and you can teach them that they have to hold onto the handlebars and they have to turn the cranks round, and the bike will go. But you can't teach them how to ride it. You can't teach them just through telling them how they balance, how they basically stop falling over. Riding a bike is essentially a millimeter corrections to falling. Essentially, you fall to one side for a few milliseconds, you fall to the other side for a few milliseconds, your brain automatically works that out. You can't teach somebody how to do that. So that's a good example of something that's knowledge that's tacit.
But you look at all the children that are out there learning to ride bikes, and it's always someone showing them how to ride a bike and teaching
It's
them.
somebody showing them how to operate a bike. It's not somebody showing them how to ride it. So it's showing them how to operate the machinery. How to operate a bike is explicit knowledge. So how to turn the handlebars, how to turn the cranks, that's explicit because you can teach somebody how to do it. What you can't teach somebody to balance on a bike.
Well, if you hold the seat,
Well, they're not riding a bike.
When I was young, my dad would hold the seat and I'd learn how to balance.
But he didn't.
Right, which is part of learning how
But he
to
didn't
ride a
tell
bike.
you what to do. He didn't say, you'll fall to the left, and then you need to immediately correct yourself and fall to the right, and then fall to the left again and fall to the right again. Because if he taught you that, you would have fallen off very, very quickly, and you would have just kept falling off. So that act of you learning, and you essentially, or your brain teaching itself about that balance, that's tacit. That's not explicit knowledge.
Right.
And it's important, so important in terms of how people might use software, for example. A lot of how people may use something it is tacit. It's not something that you can explicitly tell somebody. Sometimes you can't say, well, what you might say something. Why did you do that? Why do you click on that? Why do you? I always do it like that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to know that. That's tacit. And I think it's very, very important to, from a testing perspective, to get that understanding of the differences between the two.
I think the lines are a bit blurred though, because you might think that you are telling or instructing someone, giving them guidance on how to use a website or a web form. It could be an application form. You say, this is how you fill in the application form. But yeah, you're totally right. There could be other stuff that they do, different input methods, for example.
It may look exactly like the form that they've used already, and they may fill it in exactly the same way as they've always done.
Yep.
So I think it also becomes. I mean, this is why we do things, user testing. It's why we do things like A/B testing and stuff like that, because
Requirements gathering.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
Like
Well, that
requirements testing.
usability testing. That is, again, it's very much that's around requirements for the UX, for the UI. And so I think that's why a lot of that happens, because you want to be able to understand how users are going to use it. So much of that is tacit. The only way you can essentially get that information is by giving your product to that bunch of users and seeing what happens.
Okay, so explicit knowledge is the opposite of tacit then, where you can learn, right?
It's what the software should do. That's explicit. You can, if you have a requirements document or some instruction manual, something that tells you what it should be doing, that's knowledge which has been provided to you, which is explicit. It's explicit knowledge. That's what the software is supposed to do. If it doesn't do that, then it's kind of failed that explicit knowledge check.
Okay.
There's a whole bunch of tacit knowledge as well, but they're kind of almost the bare minimum.
So essentially anything that allows you to build up your models of a system
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
is what your explicit knowledge would be based on.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think the tacit versus explicit knowledge book's what's Harry Collins?
Yep.
Yeah, it's
Harry
a very
Collins.
good book. I would definitely recommend reading that one.
I've bought it, but I've lent it out to someone because I was right in the middle of reading my
That's not the one you lent me.
influence book. No. I can't remember who I lent it to.
That's a mistake.
I
If
know.
ever I've heard one.
I've done that with so many books. Yeah, but influence. That's another book that I was reading that while I bought the other book that I lent out to someone. So
What influenced you to buy the tacit versus explicit knowledge book?
it was a blog post that I read.
Mm.
Can't remember whose blog post it was, but they mentioned the book in it, and I figured
okay.
that's a book that
Yeah.
I don't have. So
I think the ability to influence is so very important,
Yeah.
particularly from a testing perspective, and at so many levels. So it's not just the ability to influence from a tester perspective, but particularly from a test management perspective as well. And
yeah,
I think you definitely, to be effective at that level, you need to really sharpen up your influencing skills and your ability essentially to sell ideas to people.
influence skills are, I would say, it's the second most important after lateral thinking skills. Influence skills are the second most important skill for a tester, I'd say,
Yeah.
because working with anyone on the project that have any sort of misconceptions about testing, you have to influence them. You have to get round the difficulties through communication, through influence.
I think you have to understand the person you're influencing as well. I think that's very
Definitely.
important. You have to understand their preferred communication. You have to understand that if there's any hidden agendas in there.
Yeah.
You've got to understand essentially what's in it for them. I think is also
Yep.
very important.
But also, I think you have to build a rapport with your team members
It's
as well.
contextual.
You've got to,
It's definitely contextual.
yeah. You can come out to a pub and have a chat with them off the record, and share viewpoints.
Yeah. Buy them a beer.
Yeah. Tea, if it's in the office.
That's true.
Tea's a great test tool.
It is.
I wrote a
I'm
blog about
sure
that.
I've read a blog post
Yeah,
about that
yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah, tea and cake.
But
When
that's
you think
kind of a
about
bit of a, you've got to kind of look at that's a classic example of looking at kind of almost what's in it for them. And yes, it may be that you want them to do something. What's in it for them? At a very simplistic level, they get a cake.
True, but I'd be buying the cake anyway. You know?
Fair enough. But that merely means that you've made that's a good example of
sharing.
It's a good example of where you've made that particular part of an influencing model just part of your day-to-day work, essentially your day-to-day life.
Yeah.
So it's just something you do.
Yep.
It's, you happen to be able to explain why you do it. Some people might say, "Why do you buy cake?" I don't really know.
Well, primarily I buy it so
coming
I
a bit
can
tacit,
get
yeah.
some cake. But then because I like to share, that's actually how I stumbled across influence skills.
Yeah.
Because I used to, well, in my last company I used to do Friday donuts.
Yeah.
And because I wanted a donut every Friday, and it was in Tesco's, and it was like 2 for £1 packs. So I figured I'll just get donuts and share them out in the office, and it became a regular thing. Because of that, I realised that it was becoming easier to test. It was making my life easier as a tester, So, with not just getting people to help, like testing tasks, or getting people to listen more about what testing involves and how to think like a tester, things like that. But there's a lot more as well around about like environments and things like that, getting help from developers with environments and
we used to have a session every couple of weeks when I used to work at Nokia, which is exactly the same. It's called Donut Day. For a half an hour, everybody from the company would basically gather in the auditorium, and there'd be tea and coffee and donuts laid on. And it was a great way of basically putting everyone together and getting people from different departments or from different disciplines to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And it worked far more because it wasn't something that was forced, and it was something that people bought into. It worked. Whereas if you just said, you will go to the auditorium now and talk to people from a different department or a different discipline, and you will solve a lot of your problems this way, people would have been instantly turned off. And that's a really good example of how the organisers of that influenced me and influenced us, because they did something that in turn would help us to influence others.
Yeah.
But it was definitely that influence. It was getting that buy-in, essentially. Whether you realise that you're buying into it, or whether you just think, "Oh, great, free donuts."
It's interesting because it opens up the water cooler effect.
Yeah.
where people get around the water cooler and it's more the casual chat, like you would have in a pub over a pint.
Yeah.
But generally, if it's in the office, you're talking about work stuff. So because it's more open and more free, you can resolve a lot more than sitting in a meeting room, because people will automatically get standoffish in a meeting room.
It's that relationship building that it's very
Exactly.
it's very easy to overlook, and it's a really bad mistake to overlook. Really bad.
That's why I like using tea, because generally when you're making tea, it's around the kettle. And the people that are having the tea break as well are standing around the kettle with you. So
Yeah.
it works.
That's a good point.
It works. So we've not spoken about inattentional blindness yet.
We haven't.
I love this phenomenon.
Yes.
It's incredible.
Yeah, the invisible gorilla and all that.
Yeah, that book is great.
Mm.
Have you?
I've
read
not read it.
No. It's really good. There's a lot of really good examples and studies that the guys that wrote it do around about how people can get this inattentional blindness
Yeah.
so much. It happens to everyone, probably on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the human brain works, particularly in relation to things like unintentional blindness. You think you understand your brain, you think you know how it works, and you think it works well, and in reality, it's very easily fooled.
Yep, it's incredible. But how do you kind of cure that? How do you avoid this? Being a tester is very important.
Well, I think being aware of it is the first stage. If you're unaware of it, it's much more likely to happen.
But even if you are aware of it, it's like you still be tricked. Granted, once you learn about that single thing that's tricking you, then you won't be tricked by that again. But there's still a million other things that you won't be tricked by.
Yeah,
So
potentially.
maybe it's an experience thing.
Yes.
Maybe once you build up your experiences of being tricked so many times, and being blind to so many things, but learning about the things that you're blind to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is like that classic invisible gorilla where so many people don't see the gorilla first time around. The minute you tell them there's a gorilla in there, they pick it straight away.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just, and that's experience. You've given them the experience of the fact there is a gorilla in there.
Yeah. The colour changing card trick.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the other famous one, isn't it?
So we've covered quite a lot when it comes to thinking skills and psychology and testing. Anything else you want to add?
I think only that this is only the very, very beginning. I think the amount of research that's done in the psychology community into how we think and how we act is huge. And I think as a testing community, we've just begun to kind of dip into this. There's a few people who've done presentations at major conferences on it, but we're only kind of like touching the tip of the iceberg. So I would say we all need to understand more. We all need to research a heck of a lot more on this, and also we need to we need to make sure we're questioning what we research.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Not all psychology theories are necessarily right.
Or important.
Indeed.
Maybe.
Indeed.
Okay, cool. So
that's this week's testing in the pub.